It was just past midnight on a cold November night when the call came through. Briston Hollow was the kind of town where nothing much happened after dark, and Officer Kyle Mercer was halfway through a quiet overnight shift. The streets were empty, the occasional porch light flickering through the mist. He and his partner, Officer Lena Durand, were parked near the old rail yard, sipping gas station coffee when dispatch crackled to life. A welfare check routine on paper at an aging brick apartment complex just off Hollis Street. Neither of them knew yet that this night would haunt them for years. Kyle had been a patrol officer for 6 years, and though he'd seen his share of domestic disputes and overdose calls, he'd never shaken the feeling that something could always go sideways. Lena Durand, his partner that night, was sharper, steadier 12 years on the force, and known for her calm in chaos. The two worked well together, sharing an unspoken rhythm on calls. The request came from a man named Eli Bradford, concerned about his ex-girlfriend, Camille Hart. She'd sent him strange, disjointed messages, the kind that hinted at something far worse than heartbreak. Kyle felt a chill that wasn't from the weather. They rolled up to the address around 12:45 a.m., a squat 3-story brick building with peeling paint and a dim porch light barely hanging on. Kyle cut the engine, and the hum of their cruiser faded into the silence. Apartment 2B was on the second floor, but no lights were visible from the street, not even the glow of a television. For someone who'd been texting just an hour earlier, that felt off. Kyle and Lena climbed the narrow stairs, their boots echoing on the metal steps. At the door, Kyle knocked firmly. "Police, we're here to check on you." No answer. He tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. Lena suggested calling Camille's number, which Eli had provided. Kyle dialed from his department-issued phone. It rang twice. Then someone picked up. Breathing shallow and faint, whispered through the line. The moment Kyle heard the faint breathing through the phone, a new urgency took hold. Then the line went dead, but not before both officers caught the muffled ringtone from inside the apartment. Camille was in there. Kyle stepped closer to the door and raised his voice. "Camille, this is the police. We're here to help. Open the door." Still no response. But then, just barely, he caught a low, garbled sound like someone trying to speak through water or gauze, slurred, incoherent, and haunting. It was enough to justify entry. Kyle shouted one last warning, then heard the quiet click of the deadbolt unlocking. The door didn't open, but it was no longer locked. He exchanged a look with Lena, both drawing closer to the frame with hands near their holsters. Kyle pushed the door open slowly with the side of his boot. What they saw on the other side froze them in place. Camille stood in the dark, completely nude, dripping wet. Her skin a ghostly blue-gray. Her arms hung limp, and blood streamed from cuts across her palms and fingers. Her eyes were vacant. She swayed like she might fall. Kyle instinctively stepped forward, reaching for a blanket draped over the back of the couch. Camille didn't flinch, didn't blink, just kept mumbling incoherently, her lips barely moving. He gently wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, the dampness soaking through almost instantly. Lena was already on the radio calling for EMS. As Kyle scanned the room, the strangeness only deepened. The apartment was dark, eerily so, with no working lights despite multiple flicked switches. Instead, dozens of candles flickered throughout on windowsills, tabletops, even the bathroom floor casting long, twitching shadows across the walls. The air was thick with a metallic, almost rotting scent. That's when he saw it. Written across the living room wall in streaks of dark red, likely her own blood, were the words, "The Seven-Headed Beast." The handwriting was uneven, trembling like it had been scrawled in pain or frenzy. In the bathroom, the words "Dis reveals" were smeared above the mirror. Kyle's flashlight caught the tub next. The water inside was murky brown still and foul-smelling, with a congealed film of blood settled near the drain. From the looks of it, Camille had been submerged for hours. How she was even standing defied explanation. It was like stepping into the aftermath of a ritual no one wanted to witness. EMS arrived within 10 minutes, rushing up the stairs with equipment in tow. The paramedics took one look at Camille and went to work wrapping her in thermal blankets and starting an IV. One of them muttered something about severe hypothermia and blood loss, while another suggested a possible overdose. She was still mumbling, eyes unfocused, as they gently eased her onto the stretcher and wheeled her out. Kyle and Lena stood silently for a moment before beginning their sweep of the apartment. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows or disturbed furniture, just candles, blood, and those chilling words scrawled on the walls. The tub water hadn't been drained. The whole place felt frozen in the moment, like something had paused time just long enough for them to step inside. Once Camille was safely en route to the hospital, Kyle radioed for a detective. This wasn't just a welfare check anymore. It had become a potential crime scene or something stranger, something no training manual had prepared them for. Back at the station, after the report was filed and the scene turned over to detectives, Kyle couldn't shake the images from his mind, the flickering candlelight, the dark tub, and Camille's empty stare. Something about the words on the wall gnawed at him. That night, unable to sleep, he started digging. The seven-headed beast, turned up in Sumerian mythology, an ancient creature defeated by the god Ninurta, its body displayed as a warning. It wasn't some random phrase. Then came Dis reveals. After a bit more searching, Kyle found it in The Divine Comedy. Dis was the fortified city within Dante's Inferno, surrounding the lowest circles of hell, those reserved for betrayal, heresy, and sin beyond redemption. The symbolism was disturbing. It wasn't just blood and candles, it was intentional. These weren't the ravings of a woman in a mental break. Camille had been reenacting or trapped inside some form of ancient and literary vision of hell. The deeper Kyle read, the darker it all felt like the story wasn't over. In the days that followed, Kyle kept returning to that apartment in his thoughts, not physically but mentally, over and over. He couldn't forget Camille's lifeless expression, or the oppressive silence that had filled the room like smoke. The more he considered the symbolism, the more it felt like they hadn't interrupted a tragedy. They'd stumbled into the middle of something far older, far deeper. There was no clear motive, no cult, no criminal trail. Camille remained hospitalized, unresponsive, as if whatever had happened still held her in place. Kyle found himself questioning things he'd never doubted, like whether darkness could manifest in more than just the criminal sense. He wasn't a superstitious man, but this call had left something inside him changed. He no longer saw every scene as black and white crime and solution. Some things, like what happened in apartment 2B, lurked in gray spaces where reason couldn't reach. And for the first time, that truth unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Kyle never returned to Briston Hollow's apartment 2B, though sometimes during quiet night shifts, his thoughts drifted there. The flicker of a candle in a window, the faint sound of water running, small things would bring it all rushing back. Camille eventually recovered enough to speak, but she refused to talk about that night. Not to doctors, not to detectives, not even to Eli. The case was quietly closed as a mental health crisis, filed and forgotten by most. But for Kyle, it never really ended. It stayed with him, proof that sometimes evil doesn't knock or break in. Sometimes it waits inside, lit by candlelight, whispering through blood. This isn't a story people hear often, not because it's a secret, but because once it's told, it stays with you. His name was Isaac Dunmore, and he had lived two lives, one buried deep in the underworld of Liverpool streets, the other hidden behind a badge and a lie. What happened all those years ago wasn't just a tale of crime, vengeance, or loyalty. It was the unraveling of everything he thought he understood about justice. And at the center of it all was a little girl, scared, innocent, and entirely unaware that her presence would force a man to finally decide who he truly was. Isaac Dunmore was born in the fall of 1959 in a modest hospital just off Grove Street in Liverpool, England. His mother, Merlene, was a Jamaican seamstress who worked part-time, and his father, Dr. Leonard Dunmore, was a well-respected English physician known for his deep laugh and kind presence. The Dunmore family wasn't wealthy, but with Leonard's stable income, they lived comfortably in a red brick house not far from the docks. Isaac's early years were filled with warm memories, quiet dinners, radio music drifting through the air, and the comforting sound of his father's newspaper rustling in the evenings. Everything changed in July of 1969. Just days after the family had gathered around a black and white TV to watch the Americans walk on the moon tragedy struck. Merlene sat Isaac down at the kitchen table and through teary eyes told him his father had been in an accident at the docks. He had been rushed to the hospital, but he didn't survive. "He's with Nana and Granddad now," she whispered, barely holding herself together. Isaac didn't understand death, but he felt the shift immediately. The air heavier, the silence deeper. The cheerful hum of the home was gone. In the months that followed, that absence grew, and something unspoken began to take its place. The world outside would keep moving. But for Isaac, that summer marked the beginning of a different life. One steeped in loss, silence, and shadows. After Leonard Dunmore's death, the Dunmore household unraveled quietly, like a thread pulled from the hem of something once sturdy. Merlene tried to hold it all together, but grief had its grip on her. She began drinking more, first in the evenings, then in the afternoons, and eventually whenever she wasn't working. She still made sure there was food on the table, but emotionally she checked out. Isaac, just 10 years old at the time, found himself drifting further from the home that once grounded him. By the time he was 12, the streets of Liverpool's Toxteth district had become more of a home than the one with peeling wallpaper and unanswered silence. Toxteth in the early 1970s was changing fast. The youth culture shifted from pints and smokes to pills, powders, and rolled-up notes. Isaac fell in with a crowd of boys who spent their days skipping school and their nights pushing small-time contraband uppers, downers, and hash. It wasn't long before they were carrying cash and clout far more than their teachers or neighbors suspected. Isaac didn't chase crime. He adapted to it like a sapling twisting toward the only light it could find. What began as petty street hustle soon opened doors to bigger circles. Older boys with flashier jackets, firmer handshakes, and talk of things far beyond Toxteth's corners. By age 15, Isaac wasn't just surviving. He was learning how the underworld breathed through secrets, loyalty, and violence. And though he was still a boy on paper, the city had already started carving its mark on him. He wasn't aware of it then, but something in him, something steady and watchful, had already begun taking notes. Because deep inside, the life he was stepping into a different plan had quietly begun forming. By the time Isaac turned 18, he'd become a familiar face in the alleys and backrooms of Liverpool 8. He wasn't flashy. He didn't wear gold chains or drive loud cars, but people knew his name, and more importantly, they knew who he worked with. That meant they gave him space. His closest partner was Reggie Keane, a wiry, quick-tempered man with a twitch in his eye and a laugh that rarely sounded human. Reggie was the cousin of Victor Colgrave, the man who ran the firm. They worked for one of the most feared and connected drug outfits in the north of England. Isaac and Reggie had been paired up for one reason: balance. Reggie was a hammer, Isaac the steady hand that knew when to tap and when to pull back. Their days were unpredictable, one minute ferrying boxes of pills from a docked shipping container, the next delivering a warning to a dealer behind on his payments. They weren't given official titles. This wasn't the mafia after all. But if you had to label them, Isaac was the good cop, and Reggie was the guy you never wanted to see angry. The combination worked. Reggie's reputation for violence often meant Isaac never had to raise his voice. Most people paid up after one visit with Reggie looming behind and Isaac offering the gentler way out. For a while, it was clean, controlled, business. But beneath the surface, Isaac was watching, studying. He remembered faces, tracked patterns, listened closely when others just flexed. He knew that power didn't just come from fear, it came from understanding how people operated. That awareness, that patience was what made him stand out. While Reggie thrived on chaos, Isaac was already thinking a few moves ahead. And somewhere deep inside, a voice kept asking him, how far can you go before you forget who you are? Tensions began to simmer in the summer of '88. Up until then, the unspoken rule among the local firms was simple: stick to your patch. Everyone had their corners, their regulars, their quiet little rhythms. But when Dean Harkness took over one of the neighboring outfits, everything changed. Dean was younger than most, ambitious and arrogant enough to believe that territory was an outdated concept. He started sending his boys, skinny kids, with second-hand scooters and cheap leather jackets onto Victor Colgrave's streets to poach customers. At first, it was subtle. Then it wasn't. Victor didn't take kindly to disrespect, and Isaac and Reggie were sent to deliver a conversation. They caught up with two of Dean's pushers outside a betting shop off Lodge Lane. Isaac tried to be reasonable, calm. But the dealers weren't interested in diplomacy. They laughed, insulted Victor, and cracked jokes about Reggie's twitch. That was enough to flip the switch. Reggie yanked one off his bike and beat him bloody with the front wheel grinding his face into the pavement, like it owed him money. The other ran, but not far enough to escape a broken rib and a boot to the side of the head. Isaac hadn't planned for violence that day, but he didn't stop it either. And for the first time, he didn't feel sorry afterward. That scared him more than he cared to admit. He told himself it was necessary, that sometimes you had to bloody a nose to protect your firm's name. But he knew the rules had shifted. This wasn't just a turf scuffle. Something had cracked. And in the space where old boundaries once held something darker, had begun bleeding through. No one expected the retaliation to come so fast or so violently. Just 3 nights after Reggie smashed Dean Harkness's boy into the sidewalk, Victor's quiet red brick house in Wavertree was hit. Around 9:10 p.m., while his 2 kids were watching cartoons on the living room floor, someone stepped out of a battered van and fired a shotgun through the front window. The blast shattered the glass, tore through the curtains, and sent splinters flying across the room. By sheer luck or divine timing, the children had been lying on their stomachs just inches below the spray. They walked away with cuts and bruises, but Victor was never the same. The next morning, the firm was in a frenzy. Isaac, Reggie, and half the crew scoured the city for any trace of Dean or his runners, but it was like they'd vanished. Houses were empty. Doors didn't open. People who used to nod in passing now looked away. Dean had done more than retaliate. He'd declared war, then disappeared into the smoke. But the whispers that followed were more chilling than the attack itself. Word was that Dean had gone rogue, acting without the support of his firm. Worse still, he wasn't just targeting Victor's crew, he was coming for their families. And that meant Reggie's family too. Isaac felt the ground shifting beneath him. This wasn't business anymore. The rules were gone. It was personal, unpredictable, and spiraling fast. For the first time, he saw real fear in Reggie's eyes. Not for himself, but for the people he couldn't protect. And fear made Reggie reckless. Isaac knew they had stepped into a different game, one with no boundaries, no bottom, and no promise that anyone would make it out alive. Only one thing was certain: they had to find Dean Harkness before he found them. 2 weeks passed, and Dean Harkness was still nowhere to be found. The city felt tense, like it was holding its breath, waiting for the next crack of violence. Victor's crew kept their heads low and their guns closer. Reggie, usually the first to swagger into a pub or shout across a street, had gone quiet. He barely left his flat. Isaac could see it. He wasn't sleeping, wasn't eating right. He checked on his mother 3 times a day and started driving his younger sister to work, circling the block until she came back out. The threat wasn't abstract anymore. It was standing outside people's front doors. And then it happened. Reggie's sister, Alicia Keene, 27, full-time nurse and part-time backbone of the family, was ambushed outside her building on a rainy Thursday night. Dean didn't pull the trigger himself, or so people said. But one of his guys, wearing a black hoodie and riding pillion on a dirt bike, fired a single round into her back before disappearing into traffic. She survived the shooting, but not the infection. 3 days later, she died in the hospital, her lungs filled with fluid from a hospital-acquired superbug. Reggie got the call just after dawn. By noon, he'd punched a hole through Victor's office wall and was threatening to kill Dean's entire bloodline. Victor didn't argue. The order was simple and brutal. Find Dean's daughter and make an example. Isaac knew better than to question it out loud. Reggie was wild with grief, and Victor had been looking for a reason to crush Dean's legacy completely. Taking his daughter Lily Harkness wasn't about leverage anymore. It was punishment. Blood for blood, an eye for an eye. Isaac watched it unfold with a sick feeling in his gut. He'd seen plenty of violence, plenty of chaos. But this wasn't firm business. This wasn't about turf or profit. This was grief weaponized, and it terrified him. The lines had blurred beyond recognition. And somewhere deep down, he knew this was the moment that would either break him or force him to finally choose which side he was really on. Lily Harkness was just 6 years old when her world was torn apart by a feud she couldn't even begin to understand. Reggie tracked her down through a whispered tip someone owed him a favor and handed over an address in a quiet village on the outskirts of Manchester. She was staying with an aunt, tucked away in a cozy stone cottage surrounded by hedges and ivy. Isaac didn't know what to expect when Reggie told him to be ready at 200 sharp. He thought they were heading to lean on someone for information. Instead, Reggie handed him a scrap of paper with the address and a road map, telling him to drive while he pulled a black balaclava over his head. The abduction happened fast. Reggie knocked on the front door, smiled when an elderly woman answered, then shoved his way inside. Moments later, he emerged carrying Lily like a duffel bag, small, limp, and terrified. He tossed her into the back seat of the car, slammed the door, and screamed at Isaac to drive. No one chased them. No sirens. Just the sound of tires on wet pavement and Lily's soft, confused whimpering. They hid her in an old cowshed near St. Helens, an abandoned reeking building that hadn't seen life in decades. They tied her wrists and ankles, but gently, almost with care. Isaac promised they would take her back soon, that no one would hurt her. She calmed a little. She even asked for chips. That night, Reggie went out to get food, or so he said. When he returned, he wasn't holding dinner. He was pale, soaked in sweat, and in his hand was a rusted hacksaw. Alicia had died earlier that afternoon, and Victor had given the green light, no more games. They were going to send Dean a message. Reggie walked into the shed, slowly, eyes bulging, staring at Lily, as if she weren't real. Isaac stood frozen. Every instinct told him this was the moment. Not just of violence, but of choice, between who he was and who he'd always been pretending to be. His hand went to the pistol in his waistband, not to aim at the girl, but at the man beside him. Because this wasn't a job anymore. This was a line, and he was done crossing them. Reggie didn't notice the pistol at first. His focus was locked on Lily, his hands twitching, his breath shallow and erratic. He held the hacksaw like he didn't know how to use it, or maybe like he was forcing himself to remember. Isaac stood still between the cold cement walls of the shed, the stench of mildew and decay thick around them. The only sounds were Lily's quiet sniffles and the distant creak of old wood in the rafters. Isaac's heart pounded, but his hand was steady. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and firm. "What are you doing?" "Reg?" Reggie didn't answer. He just kept walking toward the girl, his eyes wide, unblinking. Isaac drew the pistol, slowly raising it, not at Lily, but at Reggie. That stopped him. For the first time in years, Reggie looked confused. Not angry, not wild, just lost. "You aiming that at me?" he said, blinking like he'd misunderstood. Isaac nodded once. "Put it down. Back away from her." Reggie's voice cracked. "Victor said?" "I don't give a damn what Victor said," Isaac cut in. "You're not doing this. Not in front of me." There was a long pause. The tension in the air was suffocating. And then Isaac took a breath and did what no one in that shed could have expected. He told Reggie the truth. "I'm not who you think I am. I work for Merseyside Police. I've been undercover this whole time." Reggie staggered back like he'd been hit. "You're lying," he said, but the tone in his voice said he already believed it. "I'm not here to arrest you." "Not today," Isaac said. "But if you touch that girl, you'll give me no choice." For a long, terrifying second, Reggie didn't move. Then slowly, he let the saw drop to the dirt. Isaac could see his hands trembling. Without another word, Reggie turned and stumbled out of the shed into the darkness. He didn't even look back. Isaac rushed to untie Lily. She was shivering, confused, still asking about her parents. As he picked her up, he whispered, "You're going to be okay." But in that moment, he wasn't sure if he meant her or himself. All he knew was the act was done. His mask was off, and there was no going back. Isaac didn't wait. The moment Reggie disappeared into the tree line, he lifted Lily into his arms and carried her through the overgrown pasture behind the shed. The rain had started again, light but steady, soaking through his jacket as he half ran, half stumbled across the muddy field. His gun was still tucked in his waistband, cold against his spine. Lily clung to him, head buried in his shoulder, too exhausted to cry. Isaac whispered to her with every step, "You're safe now. I've got you." But in truth, he wasn't sure what would happen next. They reached a farmhouse just beyond the hedgerow, a faded white building with a sagging porch and wind chimes made of old spoons clinking softly in the wind. Isaac banged on the door until an elderly man answered, startled but kind-eyed. The moment he saw the girl, wet, dirty, tied at the wrists, he stepped aside without asking questions. Isaac called it in from the man's landline, giving only the essentials. "This is Dunmore. Operation Lowlight has concluded. We have the girl. She's safe." Then he hung up. Within an hour, unmarked cars arrived. A plainclothes team took Lily gently from his arms and led her inside. She looked back once, eyes wide, unsure, and Isaac gave her a soft smile. She didn't know who he was, not really, but she didn't scream. That meant everything. Back outside, the team leader pulled Isaac aside. "We'll handle the cleanup. Your cover's blown, obviously." Isaac nodded. "Yeah," he said, "obviously." By nightfall, Reggie was gone, no trace. Victor's crew unraveled within days, swept up in the arrests that followed. Dean Harkness, too, was finally brought in, found holed up in a flat in Leeds. During his sentencing, months later, his solicitor read a statement, a formal apology, and a personal thank you to the unknown officer who saved his daughter's life. Dean never knew Isaac's name. Maybe he still doesn't. But those words, they stuck. For Isaac, they were worth more than any medal. Isaac Dunmore never went back to Liverpool, not to stay at least. After the operation ended and the dust finally settled, he requested a permanent transfer to London and was reassigned to the Metropolitan Police's undercover division. The Merseyside force offered him a quiet commendation, a handshake behind closed doors, and a promise to keep his real identity out of any paperwork. It wasn't glamour, and it wasn't justice in the Hollywood sense, but it was enough. He kept his head down and spent the next 2 decades embedded in different units, chasing different devils. He led major operations, brought down entire trafficking networks, and even helped design new undercover training protocols. But no case ever came close to what happened in that damp cowshed outside St. Helens. He never forgot Lily Harkness's face, mud-streaked, tear-wet, trusting him completely in the most terrifying moment of her young life. And he never forgot Dean's words, read aloud in that courtroom. "To the officer who saved my daughter, you didn't just save her life. You saved mine." Isaac still kept a printed copy of the statement, tucked inside a weathered folder in his desk. It was never about forgiveness. It was about proof that something good came from the ruin. Now in his 60s, Isaac sometimes returns to Liverpool for a match at Anfield or a quiet visit with an old colleague over tea. The city's changed. So has he, but the memories remain tangled and bittersweet. He walks the streets and remembers who he used to be and who he chose to become. And though he carries no badge now and answers to no firm or force, one thing remains true. On that day in that shed when everything could have gone wrong, he drew a line. Not for the job, not for revenge, but for a little girl. And that made all the difference. On a crisp summer afternoon in a quiet Seattle neighborhood, Detective Mark Sullivan cruised through the tree-lined streets under a cloudless blue sky. The air was calm, the kind of peaceful day that makes you almost forget the dangers lurking just beneath the surface. Mark's seasoned 32-year-old officer felt confident and focused as he carried out his routine patrol. Little did he know, this seemingly ordinary day was about to take a sudden, life-changing turn. As Mark rounded the corner onto West Pine Street, his instincts prickled, a feeling he had learned to trust over his years on the force. Ahead, a man stood near a worn-out pickup, pacing nervously. Mark approached cautiously, calling out a greeting, but the man's eyes darted wildly, his body tense, as if ready to explode. Suddenly, in a heartbeat, the man later identified as Carl Benson pulled a 9mm pistol from his jacket. Time seemed to slow for Mark as he locked eyes with Carl, whose face was twisted with fear and anger. Without warning, Carl raised the gun and squeezed the trigger. In that terrifying instant, Mark realized that the calm summer day had vanished, replaced by a pulse-pounding moment where life and death hung by a thread. In that heart-stopping moment, Mark's world seemed to freeze, his eyes locked on the barrel of the gun pointed straight at him. But then, something unexpected happened. The hammer clicked, but there was no bang. The chamber was empty, or maybe the safety was on. Mark never found out for sure. Instinct took over as adrenaline surged through his veins. He lunged forward before Carl could react. The shock on Carl's face was unmistakable. The man's grip loosened, and the pistol slipped from his hand, clattering onto the cracked pavement. Carl's terrified screams of "Don't shoot me" echoed in the air, as if denying his own actions. In those fleeting seconds, Mark realized just how close he had come to losing everything, saved only by a twist of fate and a moment's misfire. Back at the precinct, Mark struggled to steady himself. His hands trembled uncontrollably, and his right leg bounced like it had a mind of its own. An aftershock of adrenaline he couldn't shake. Trying to focus on writing the arrest report, he accidentally spilled water across his desk. The rush of emotions, fear, relief, disbelief, washed over him in waves. Though alive, Mark felt the heavy weight of that near-death moment, lingering, a silent reminder that nothing in his line of work should ever be taken for granted. That close call left an indelible mark on Mark's outlook, not just as an officer, but as a man who now understood just how fragile life can be. He realized that if Carl had known how to properly handle the gun, his story might have ended very differently. From that day forward, Mark approached every call with heightened caution, double-checking his gear and never underestimating the unpredictable nature of his job. This experience taught him humility and respect for the randomness of fate, a lesson he carried with him every time he stepped onto the streets. For Mark, surviving wasn't just about skill. It was about appreciating each moment and acknowledging how quickly everything can change in an instant. Mark's detailed report of the harrowing incident is preserved in the Seattle Police Department archives. Recorded on July 15, 1994, at 450 West Pine Street, his account stands as a powerful reminder of the unpredictable dangers officers face and the thin line between life and death on the streets of America. This story isn't just about one officer's near escape. It's a testament to the unpredictable reality of law enforcement and a reminder that sometimes survival comes down to a single moment of luck. For those who serve and protect every day is a fight against the unexpected. At around 1:15 p.m., Marion County Dispatch received an unsettling call from Jessica Landry, a concerned resident of Cedar Lane, Tennessee. She described a neighbor named Brian Callahan running frantically down their suburban street, screaming that his skin was burning, though she saw no flames or smoke. Her frantic report set in motion one of the strangest incidents local authorities would ever encounter. Responding to the call, Sheriff Samuel Bennett anticipated a routine disturbance, perhaps involving substance abuse or mental health. Little did he realize, as he approached Cedar Lane, he was about to witness something far beyond his wildest imagination. As Sheriff Bennett stepped onto the quiet manicured lawn of 2117 Cedar Lane, the afternoon took a horrifying turn. Lying motionless on the neatly trimmed grass was Brian Callahan, his body severely charred, smoke still rising eerily from his blackened skin. Yet inexplicably, the surrounding area was completely untouched. No burnt grass, no scorched sidewalks, and no signs of accelerants. Bennett felt a chill run down his spine, realizing instantly this was no ordinary incident. The scene defied logic, challenging everything he knew about fire and leaving him utterly bewildered. Neighbors Jessica Landry and Mark Thompson shared eerily consistent accounts. Moments earlier, they'd watched helplessly as Brian sprinted up and down Cedar Lane, hysterically screaming about his flesh burning, though they saw no visible flames initially. Then, without warning, Brian burst violently into flames, collapsing onto the lawn. Witnesses recounted, visibly shaken, how the intense blaze seemed to vanish as suddenly as it appeared, leaving behind his charred remains, yet astonishingly not scorching even an inch of the surrounding grass. Immediately, Sheriff Bennett secured the surreal scene and summoned emergency responders. Veteran firefighter David Mercer soon arrived, carefully examining every detail. Despite extensive analysis, Mercer confirmed there were no accelerants or logical explanations for the mysterious blaze. His baffled reaction underscored just how strange this incident was, deepening the unsettling mystery enveloping the suburban neighborhood of Cedar Lane. With no clear explanation, investigators considered spontaneous human combustion. Brian's charred body was sent to forensic pathologist Dr. Amanda Prescott for further study, hoping science might unravel the baffling mystery that left a small Tennessee town stunned and searching for answers. Sheriff Bennett remains haunted by the inexplicable tragedy, struggling to comprehend a fire that defied all logic, a mystery that will linger in his mind long after the flames have faded. James Jimmy Caldwell, a 55-year-old veteran police officer, had spent over 35 years patrolling the streets of St. Louis, Missouri. Known for his calm demeanor and quick thinking under pressure, Jimmy had witnessed the worst of human nature, from violent crimes to the most distressing emergencies. However, it wasn't the chaos of the streets that had left the deepest mark on him, but rather the toll it had taken on his psyche. After years of responding to violent calls and navigating high-stress situations, he had seen many colleagues burn out. In the summer of 2023, Jimmy found himself reflecting on a troubling pattern within his own department: the lack of mental health resources for officers. In a city that was no stranger to turmoil, the St. Louis Police Department, though well-funded for surveillance and equipment, had no significant support system in place for the emotional and psychological needs of its officers. The city's officers were trained to protect the public, but who was protecting them when the weight of their job became too much to bear? Jimmy's thoughts became even more pressing when he received a disturbing report involving two younger officers, Carlos Mendez and John Thomas, and an incident that would forever alter the course of his career. As Jimmy Caldwell sat at his desk one fateful evening in September 2023, the radio crackled to life. A call had come in regarding a domestic dispute at a small residence in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of St. Louis. Two younger officers, Carlos Mendez and John Thomas, were dispatched to the scene, responding to what seemed like a routine call. But as the minutes passed, something didn't sit right with Jimmy. He had been a cop long enough to trust his instincts, and a nagging feeling told him this would not be a simple case. When Carlos and John arrived, they found 30-year-old David Ramirez sprawled at the base of a tree, struggling to breathe. Blood poured from his face and neck, a gunshot wound tearing through his body. He was fighting to stay conscious, his breath shallow, and labored a clear signal that his life hung in the balance. But instead of rushing to his aid or calling for emergency medical services, the two officers did nothing. Instead, they exchanged callous remarks, oblivious to the weight of the situation. "We better take this mother down," Carlos muttered, while John, already nearing the end of his shift, shrugged and said, "I get off in 30 minutes. Let's just cruise around and come back later." In those agonizing minutes, David Ramirez's fate was sealed. The officers, laughing as they left the scene, failed to grasp the gravity of their negligence. When they finally returned, it was too late. By the time another officer arrived and medical services were finally summoned, David Ramirez had already succumbed to his injuries. It was a moment that would haunt Jimmy Caldwell for the rest of his life, a moment where duty was forgotten and a man died needlessly. As the minutes ticked by, Jimmy Caldwell couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in his gut. The report about the domestic dispute had taken a grim turn, and Jimmy's mind raced with unanswered questions. He soon learned that a third officer, Anna Pierce, had arrived on the scene just as Carlos Mendez and John Thomas were making their return. Anna, newer to the department, but already recognized for her sharp instincts, immediately noticed something was wrong. She found David Ramirez barely clinging to life, his pulse weak and his breathing labored. Without hesitation, Anna radioed for emergency medical services and began to perform first aid on David. What happened next shocked Jimmy to his core. When Carlos and John returned to the scene, they acted as though it was their first time there, going through the motions of searching for the victim, as if they had no prior knowledge of where he lay. Anna couldn't believe what she was witnessing. She knew that Carlos and John had abandoned their post earlier, and now their fake concern was nothing more than an attempt to cover up their earlier neglect. The realization hit like a punch to the stomach. This wasn't just an unfortunate lapse in judgment. It was a betrayal of the very principles that Jimmy had spent his career defending. He watched in disbelief as Anna confronted her colleagues, vowing to expose them for their actions. What was supposed to be a routine domestic dispute had now turned into a chilling reminder of how easily the system could fail those it was meant to protect. By the time emergency medical services arrived at the scene, it was too late. David Ramirez had been left untreated for nearly half an hour, his condition deteriorating beyond recovery. When the paramedics rushed him to the hospital, his prognosis was grim. Despite their best efforts, it was clear that the delay in medical intervention had sealed his fate. The attending surgeon later revealed that had help arrived even a few minutes earlier, David might have survived. The reality of the situation hit hard for everyone involved, but none more so than Anna Pierce. She had done everything she could to save David, yet her colleagues' negligence still haunted her. As the news broke about Carlos Mendez and John Thomas, public outrage began to grow. David's family, particularly his mother who lived in Puerto Rico, were devastated not only by his death, but by the cruel irony of it all. The officers meant to protect him had instead abandoned him in his final moments. In an emotional interview, David's mother expressed how the officers' actions were not just a failure of duty, but a profound violation of humanity. The press coverage intensified, and the public demanded justice. Within the police department, the response was swift. Carlos and John were placed on suspension, and an investigation was launched. The truth had finally come to light. Their actions, or rather their inaction, had caused the death of an innocent man. The consequences were far-reaching, and the question remained, how many more cases like this would go unnoticed without the proper support for those who protect us? The outrage that followed David Ramirez's death was swift and intense. As the media picked up the story, the public's anger reached a fever pitch. The community demanded accountability, not just for Carlos Mendez and John Thomas, but for the entire system that allowed such a failure to happen. As details of their neglect became public, it was revealed that the officers had not only failed to render aid, but had actively avoided responsibility. The media focused on David's mother's heartbreaking statements, emphasizing the unimaginable grief of a mother who learned her son's death could have been prevented. For the department, the fallout was inevitable. Both Carlos and John were quickly placed on administrative leave and later fired. Their police licenses were permanently revoked, meaning they would never again serve in law enforcement in Missouri. Although this was a necessary step, the question lingered: could the tragedy have been avoided if the officers had received proper mental health support? Jimmy Caldwell, the seasoned officer who had been quietly watching the events unfold, began to see the cracks in the system. While the officers were punished, he knew the real issue wasn't just one case of neglect. It was a systemic failure that could lead to more incidents unless changes were made. The tragic death of David Ramirez exposed a deeper issue within law enforcement: the lack of mental health support for officers. Jimmy Caldwell, reflecting on the incident, couldn't shake the thought that Carlos Mendez and John Thomas weren't inherently bad officers. Instead, their actions seemed like a result of burnout and unaddressed psychological strain. For years, the department had focused on physical training, weaponry, and surveillance, while neglecting the emotional toll on officers. Carlos and John, once decent officers, had fallen victim to a system that offered no outlet for the intense stress and trauma they faced daily. Jimmy knew that without proper mental health resources, more incidents like this would occur. While the firing of Carlos and John was a necessary consequence, it didn't solve the root cause. It was clear to Jimmy, for the system to truly protect the public, it must also protect the mental well-being of those who serve. The failure to act in David Ramirez's case revealed a critical gap in the system: the need for better mental health support for officers. Jimmy Caldwell believed that a focus on emotional well-being alongside physical training could prevent future tragedies. He knew that without proper psychological care, law enforcement officers would continue to struggle with the psychological toll of their work. Moving forward, Jimmy called for systemic changes: mental health resources, regular psychological evaluations, and a shift in how the department viewed officer well-being. Only then could they truly serve and protect both the public and themselves. The events surrounding David Ramirez's death serve as a haunting reminder of the importance of mental health in law enforcement. While the consequences for Carlos Mendez and John Thomas were necessary, the real change lies in addressing the systemic issues that lead to such neglect. If the system can evolve to prioritize the well-being of its officers, tragedies like this might be prevented in the future. It's a call for compassion, support, and reform, a path that not only protects the public, but ensures those who serve are given the care and resources they need to do so with honor. In the early hours of March 15, 2024, the skies over New Mexico were still shrouded in darkness as Officer Liam Rivers cruised along a quiet stretch of Interstate 64. With the dawn fast approaching, his shift was nearing its end, and the empty road signaled a rare moment of peace. However, that calm was shattered when a call came through to his radio. A motorist was stranded with a flat tire, and as part of his routine duty, Liam was dispatched to assist. Pulling up behind a white sedan on the side of the road, he noticed the driver standing nearby, seemingly in need of help. Little did Liam know, this seemingly routine encounter would quickly escalate into a horrifying and tragic event. As he approached the driver, they exchanged pleasantries about the flat tire and the lack of nearby services. Liam offered to give the driver a ride to the nearest town, hoping to help him get to a repair shop. The driver graciously accepted, but in a shocking turn of events, the moment Liam rolled down his window to offer assistance, the driver suddenly produced a 9mm pistol. Before Liam could react, a single shot was fired, striking him in the neck. As he struggled to breathe, the driver walked around to the other side of the car and shot him twice more. With Liam now incapacitated, the driver pushed him into the passenger seat, took control of the police cruiser, and fled the scene. The once peaceful stretch of highway had now become a deadly crime scene, marking the beginning of an intense manhunt. As Officer Liam Rivers lay struggling for breath in the passenger seat of his own patrol car, the gravity of the situation hit him. He had just become the victim of a brutal, senseless attack. His once quiet shift had erupted into a nightmare. The driver, now in control of the police vehicle, sped down the I-64 as Liam gasped for air, each breath harder than the last. The driver, identified later as Victor Daniels, had no intention of stopping. His mission was clear escape at all costs. As they reached a frontage road near Tucumcari, a town named for an old Comanche word meaning ambush, Daniels finally pulled over. In a cold and calculated move, he dragged Liam's unconscious body out of the car and left him to die in the dust. The stillness of the desert, now a backdrop to the senseless violence. It was a horrifying scene of abandonment, a stark contrast to the warmth and safety that law enforcement officers like Liam were supposed to represent. Meanwhile, the manhunt for Daniels had already begun. News of the shooting spread like wildfire, sparking outrage and grief across New Mexico and beyond. Local law enforcement agencies worked together tirelessly, driven by the need for justice for Officer Rivers. Daniels was not a stranger to the criminal world. His long history of violent offenses, including the murder of a paramedic in a previous incident, painted him as a dangerous fugitive. He was a man on the run, but it wasn't long before he made a careless mistake. At a gas station in Albuquerque, Daniels handed over his real ID to a clerk who, recognizing him, quietly completed the transaction. The moment Daniels left the station, law enforcement was hot on his trail. It was a mistake that would soon bring his reign of terror to an end. The search for Daniels intensified as the authorities pieced together his movements and prepared to close in on the man responsible for the murder of one of their own. The story of Daniels' eventual capture reads like a dramatic thriller. With each passing minute, the tension mounted as police officers and deputies tracked him through the streets, ready to bring him to justice for his horrific crimes. The battle between law enforcement and a cold-blooded criminal had only just begun. But it was clear that Victor Daniels would not escape for much longer. The manhunt for Victor Daniels intensified with each passing hour. As law enforcement officials across New Mexico collaborated, the sense of urgency grew. They knew that bringing this killer to justice was paramount, not just for the safety of the public, but also for the memory of Officer Liam Rivers. With the stolen patrol car still out there, the search seemed like a race against time. Daniels, though a seasoned criminal, had made one crucial error at the gas station in Albuquerque. That mistake, the casual handover of his real ID to an unsuspecting clerk, was all it took to shift the momentum in the authorities' favor. The search was on, and Daniels had no idea just how quickly the walls were closing in on him. At 7:49 a.m., two deputies from the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Department found themselves positioned outside a house in a quiet suburban neighborhood, suspecting it was where Daniels had sought refuge. As they waited, the air was thick with anticipation, the still morning sky filled with tension. Moments later, they spotted a figure darting across the street, and it was clear that Daniels had spotted them too. In a heartbeat, the deputies were in pursuit. Racing through the narrow passageways between homes, the sound of their boots pounding against the pavement echoed in the cool morning air. The chase was on. Within seconds, the deputies were in the backyard of the house, guns drawn, scanning the area for any sign of Daniels. Then suddenly, a shout pierced the air. "I've got contact!" One of the deputies had spotted Daniels behind a fence, and the chase turned into a deadly game of cat and mouse. With sirens wailing in the distance, the atmosphere was charged with urgency and fear. The relentless pursuit of a man who had already claimed 2 lives was now reaching its climax. In the ensuing chaos, Daniels' fate was sealed, but not before he'd put up one final desperate fight. The intense pursuit of Victor Daniels reached its peak as the deputies, determined and resolute, pushed forward with unwavering focus. As they pursued him through the narrow passageways and backyards, they knew that every moment was critical. The tension was palpable in the cool morning air, and time seemed to stretch as the chase led them through a maze of suburban streets. Daniels, however, was a desperate man with nothing left to lose. He darted through alleys, climbed fences, and sought refuge in places that seemed to offer a fleeting sense of escape. But with every turn, law enforcement closed in relentless in their mission to bring him to justice. As the deputies advanced, they were fully aware that they were chasing a killer. A man responsible for the death of Officer Liam Rivers and a paramedic in another brutal crime. There was no room for hesitation. The lives of the deputies were on the line, but so too was the pursuit of justice for those Daniels had killed. The chase led them toward a house with a copper-brown exterior where Daniels had apparently tried to hide. The deputies split up, one taking the left side, the other the right, each moving with practiced precision. The sound of footsteps echoed in the tense silence, and every second counted. Then a deputy's voice cut through the air. "I've got contact." Daniels, in a final attempt to escape, sprinted through a small opening in the fence, hoping to evade capture, but the deputies were closing in, their guns drawn and ready. The chase intensified as one deputy hopped a fence, his heart racing with each leap. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him as the sound of sirens blared in the distance, signaling reinforcements. But as the deputy approached the backyard, a sudden cry from a nearby neighbor rang out, "He's right here!" The deputies had him cornered. Victor Daniels, now in plain sight, made a desperate attempt to flee once more, but this time he was too slow. A deputy fired several shots as Daniels attempted to climb yet another wall. When the dust settled, the fugitive lay motionless on the ground, having collapsed under the weight of his injuries. The pursuit was over. Daniels was finally in custody, but not before a dramatic and harrowing chase that would forever mark the lives of the officers involved. The sense of relief was overwhelming, but the gravity of the situation remained clear. Officer Rivers's death had sparked a relentless search, and justice had finally been served, albeit through the pain and sacrifice of many. With Victor Daniels finally in custody, the chaotic pursuit came to an abrupt end, but the emotional toll was far from over. The arrest marked the beginning of the legal aftermath, where the full weight of Daniels' horrific actions would be brought to light. As the authorities closed in on the fugitive, they uncovered the chilling evidence linking him to not only the murder of Officer Liam Rivers, but also the death of a paramedic in South Carolina. The brutality of his crimes left little room for doubt. Daniels was charged with multiple counts, including first-degree murder, carjacking, and discharging a firearm during a violent crime. His trial, set in January of 2025, was a solemn reminder of the lives destroyed by his actions. For Officer Rivers's family, the pain was immeasurable. Liam's parents, Jim and Terry Rivers, spoke of the hole left in their hearts and the irreparable damage caused by their son's untimely death. The community, too, felt the loss of a man who had dedicated his life to protecting others. In a courtroom filled with law enforcement officers, Daniels pled guilty, accepting a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. While justice was served, the memory of Liam's sacrifice and the grief that followed would remain with his family and his community forever. As the courtroom proceedings came to a close and Daniels was led away, the lingering sense of justice did little to ease the pain that would forever mark the Rivers family and their community. Officer Liam Rivers had been more than a protector of the law. He was a son, a friend, and a hero. Though his life was tragically cut short, his sacrifice would not be forgotten. His legacy lived on through the stories shared by those who knew him, the community he served, and the countless lives he touched with his courage and compassion. The quest for justice had been long, but in the end, it was a testament to the resilience of those who fight for what's right, even when the cost is the greatest. Loved this story and want more? Hit like and subscribe to show your support for the channel. We're committed to bringing you gripping, thought-provoking content that will keep you hooked. Make sure to tap the notification bell so you never miss a new video. Thank you for being part of our community. We can't wait to share even more incredible stories with you.